Hi, Misha here, and we're going to talk bayonets, specifically British SMLE short magazine Lee Enfield bayonets, mostly focusing on those from England, but talking a little bit about Australia and definitely some about India. Going to try to give an overview. This is not an overly detailed video. I know with the length you think it will be. It's not. It's just hitting the major patterns and major variations. We're not even going to go into the old Longleys or the World War II number 4s. That can be another video. But since I had an assortment of over half a dozen bayonets to show you, thought why not? So if you're interested in history and just want to kill some time, hang out with us, talk some blades, definitely share your own bayonets, and please do correct me when I'm wrong, because I know I will be, because I actually already recorded the bulk of the video and doing this at the end, so I even know myself I made some little flubs. See if you can find them, because I know they're there. If you could also like, share, and subscribe, check out Patreon. And with no further ado, let's get stabby. Alright, beginning at the beginning of the SMLE, the SMLE. Again, apologies for not having a pattern 1888. I just don't at the moment. I'm sure one will come my way. But the new short rifle, at least new as of 1903, would need a new style of bayonet, because the end cap system, and more importantly the lug, is almost upside down from the one on the Lee Metford, Lee Enfield, and their carbines like the Irish. What to do? Now, this new gun has an overall length of about 44 inches. And again, I'm going to do just rough rounding here, guys, so apologies. And it's roughly with a 24-inch barrel. So you're losing 5 or 6 inches over the long rifle. So what to do for its bayonet? Well, the first bayonet here was frankly a stopgap. This is the pattern 1903, the P03. This part is new for the SMLE, but the blade is essentially a recycling of the 88, including the crossguard style. Kind of an interesting dagger style with a double edge and then a flat in the middle, no fuller. I think it's a really neat looking bayonet. Love the sound of steel. This blade is just under 12 inches, so a foot long, giving this an overall length of about 17 inches, give or take. Ballparking. You get the idea. It's not quite a foot and a half overall. So yeah, new grip, new interface for the new rifle, but we're using the same old blade originally meant for the so-called Longley. And these generally go on quite easily. And with this on, we have a reach of roughly 56 inches. So, I'm going to stand up for a second. You know I'm not very tall, but this goes to show you where we're at here. So, little over 4.5 feet. And from the get-go, they were not happy with this. At least enough in the British military were not. The infantry, the musketeers, felt like this would not give them enough reach for going at the cavalry, and also would leave them at a disadvantage even hand-to-hand fighting with, say, someone with a Gewehr 98 Mauser and its attached bayonet. Now, The cavalry themselves, well, half the time they didn't have bayonet lugs anyway. And the Navy, they were just as interested, because they would need them for shipboard operations and going ashore in the Royal Marines, what have you. And of course, parades are always a thing. My ultimate point is, even as this rifle, the SMLE Mark I, was going into production, and they were making the pattern 03 bayonet, predominantly they were made at Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield. They made about 120,000, give or take. They were looking for its replacement. Now, this video isn't on the Enfields themselves. We've covered them a lot in the past, although this is one of my favorites just because of how early it is. But you can check out the channel if you want. So yeah, these are mostly made at Enfield. At least that was new production. Enfield would also convert around 66,000, 67,000 old P08 bayonets, so basically in the new grip. And then later on, right before World War I, the Royal Factory in Ishapur would convert 20,000, 25,000 more. My only point is that, you had about 250,000 total, about half new made, half recycled. But again, this was not what they were really angling for. Scabbard. This is a later style that has more metal here. Some have leather coming down further. This would be the outside, the leather. Tons of variations, guys, that even I'm not going to get into. The earliest attempts at a replacement, well, there weren't even attempts at a replacement, but were in 1905. It wasn't so much to exactly figure out what to replace it with as to what they would need to replace it with. They tried longer blades, even shorter blades. They tried some American, and they even had quite a large quantity of French Lebel 1886 spike bayonets that they modified to fit on the new SMLE. And as you can tell, this is a much longer, but I guess they weren't really keen on the cruciform. Sorry, it's got a lot of Cosmo. I just pulled this one out. So they weren't maybe keen on the cruciform system, but this did kind of give them an idea. Around 5 feet, 60 inches, give or take, reach would be ideal. And so we would get into sincere trials in 1906. At that time, the nation of Japan had a new spiffy rifle, the Type 38 Arisaka. Frankly, one of the best bolt actions of all time. And Japan and Britain were quite good allies, and would remain so through the First World War. And the British Navy actually adopted Arisaka variants, some Type 30s, a few Type 35s, and some Type 38s, as a substitute standard. That's the story for another day. What's important for our video isn't the rifle itself, the Type 38, but its bayonet, the Type 30. The same bayonet used on the previous models, and it would still be in service through World War II. So interoperability, there you have it. This is a long blade, shy of 18 inches, an overall length of about 22. Quite a unique layout. Instead of a point, it's kind of a half with a fuller groove, polished blade, and a hook that is allegedly used for bayonet fighting, catching a blade, and certainly used for protecting the hand. I think they also did it because it looks nice. Metal scabbard, what have you. Seeing here, definitively longer. Especially when you stick it on this here rifle. And here it is next to me. Ironically, I'm probably maybe slightly taller than the average Japanese soldier of the day and time. But yeah, this is a long blade on a long rifle. The British like this. Although, even to them, this seemed a bit much. Should have measured this, but with this on here, we're the better part of 5.5, maybe even approaching 6 feet. But it definitely has reach. I'll give them that. And this is, generally speaking, the direction they went. The Type 30 bayonet was not the only contender during the 1906 trials, but it was obviously the winner. In 1907, the Royal Arms Factory at Enfield made the first pattern test example, and then in 1908, this was put into production. The pattern 1907, the P07. Can you see the similarity? Take the scabbard off again. Yeah, almost, but not quite the same length. And polished blade with that kind of unique tip. And hooked crossguard. Obviously, the British version, the ring is closer in. Grips are shockingly similar, although again, different pattern. But yeah, the influence is extremely clear. And it gave them the reach they were looking for. And here we have it. Now, I said earlier the Mishaco was about 22 inches. I should have said more like 20, because this is about 2 inches longer on the blade. So, sorry, I'm setting in the year. I don't have math in front of me. So, whereas the Mishaco, 16 inches or so, this is about 17 and a half. And they did that because obviously they're planning to mount it to a short rifle, not a long rifle. It's still not near as tall as the Type 38 with the Type 30 bayonet. But definitely more than the, maybe reach over here, pattern 03 would have been. So they got what they wanted. Over 5 feet. This is about 61 inches, give or take, depending on how cold or hot it is. Fits the same lug, still perfectly interchangeable, something that actually will continue. And in fact, right as they adopted this in 1907, they went to this new pattern of SMLE MK.III. We went from the Mark I to the Mark III. The Mark II, for what it's worth, just because I always used to wonder myself, those were converted, updated, old Lee Metfords and Long Lees to the newer pattern. So yeah, it's transitional. We have the new fixed bridge, mag feed cutoff. Early versions would have had the volley sights. This is a 1915 BSA, so early World War I. So it has a few things deleted. Still has the windage rear sight. Again, we've done videos on these, but thought it was a good match for this here bayonet. And you might notice something a little different about this compared to other P07s you see. So let's talk about hooks. So we've got our new SMLE Mark III. We've got our new P07 bayonet. And these would be made at so many places, not just the Royal Arms Factory. You know, Sanderson, Wilkinson had made some earlier. Again, I'm not even going to try, guys. There's so many makers, especially with this version. And they would be picked up in India around 1911. Australia would begin making them. And here we have an Aussie. This is a SMLE MK.III Star, the simplified later war version, versus our 1915, which is relatively early. So you would think we'd lose our hook because of that, but not really. Here's another P07 hookless. This was actually decided to be deleted well before World War I, October of 1913, at least in the UK. Of course, it would take time to switch over, and what they would do there, as bayonets would come in for repair, refurbishment, they would lob it off. So if you have a bayonet before that date, it probably had a hook. This one is a later date, so it never did. Otherwise, they're the same for all intents and purposes. India would follow about a year later, 1914, and Australia would be the last in 1915 to get rid of the hook. By the way, black painted scabbard, which meant it was a World War II home guard. Either that or it went to India. So why? Well, as I was getting these out, this kind of exemplified it. Well, whereas the Japanese liked the hook, this hooked on my clothing. This is a very pronounced hook, especially with the scabbard on, even with it back. Things can get trapped in there. It really wasn't useful for anything. It was more decorative. It just mostly got hooked up on gear, clothing, ropes, straps. Again, think about the Navy. They're using these. It's probably not a good thing. Just get rid of it. It simplifies production. And still have a cross guard. It's fine. So not only did they stop making them, they actively chopped them off. Which means this is actually a pretty uncommon bayonet. And that's why, even though it's got some old corrosion cleaned up there, and normally I wouldn't have a bayonet in my collection like that necessarily, in this instance I don't mind it at all. In fact, the only reason I own this is because it came from a friend a year ago, and I thought it was neat, and I just haven't been able to talk myself into getting rid of it yet. So the P07 bayonet, along with the SMLE, that was the Great War combo. In fact, overall, it's estimated about 5 million were made. Wilkinson was a big maker. Sanderson didn't make as many as you think. Enfield made a lot early on, but switched over to other things. And again, lots of other contractors, not to even discount the ones in India and Australia. So this was kind of the bayonet for quite some time. And once we chop the hook off, we give it a, yeah, it pretty much stays unchanged for a number of years. In fact, this production run would last in India all the way up till 1940, and in Australia up to about 1927, and roughly the same in the UK. And yeah, it was not just used on the bolt-action Enfield. When Sterling started making the Lanchester Mark I 9mm submachine gun, the immediate predecessor to the Enfield, yep, it had a bayonet lug. Let's not even mention this ridiculous stand mag. It's not even an extended mag. This was the standard mag. From what I understand, mostly the Navy used these, along with some in the RAF. Again, we've covered this semi-automatic rebuild of the SMG in other videos, but it did have a lug, because it's essentially a copy of a German MP28 Bergmann. This is a sticky bayonet. It's the bayonet, not the gun. It had some old Cosmo in it. There we go. And now there's Cosmo on my lug. Oh well. But I wanted to show that it fit. Normally not that tight. And because this is a rework. The only really thing to point out here, notice the clearance that was to get crud out as you were sliding it on. I actually did use it earlier as Cosmoline shot out of there. Anyway, I think that was added in the middle of World War I, and there's a few different patterns. But either way, I wanted to mention the blade. You can usually tell a re-arsenal one because they have this kind of sandblasted, dull metal as opposed to polished. Makes sense. You see it on a lot of refurbished. And in India, typically if they refurbed a blade, they would give it a blued or even paint finish because of the tropics. Scabbard's a little tight on this one, but yeah, I just wanted to show that they were using on these. Now, I want to take a little bit of a detour here because there is a footnote, a disambiguation, if you will, for an alternative pattern that could easily be confused. We have to talk about the pattern 1914. Although it started off as the pattern 1913 in a whole new cartridge. Because of the war, two things happened. One, it had to revert to 303. Two, they had to make these in America. This one's a Remington. They were also manufactured by Winchester and eventually Eddystone. And of course, yes, this evolved into the US model 1917. And this is a Mauser-based action. And you might think, well, it has a very similar lug to this, but because of the end cap difference, a standard 07 bayonet, it can't reach the muzzle. So, an extremely similar, but wholly different bayonet came to be. And this is called the pattern 1913 P13 bayonet. Very similar scabbard. Notice this one does have a hanger on it. That's more US style because this is actually a US bayonet. But the British one's pretty well the same. Same length, sorry, Cosmoline all over this one. But notice the bigger gap here. So it will affix properly to an actual muzzle. Again, this would rather obviously not fit. And here we are again. Me as a rough measuring stick. A little bit longer because this is a slightly longer gun. But essentially, same reach. I don't know, 63, maybe 64 inches. Because we all know it's not the length, it's how you use it. And these definitely had an interesting reputation in the war and really are among my favorite guns. This one has its volley sights still. A lot do not. And of course the US 1917 is almost identical, except whereas this is in 303, it's in 30-06. And I think you know by now, we've done videos on it. This is about the blades. So they were similar enough that I didn't want to get confused. So there's an easy, handy-dandy ID in the grips. Notice those two ridges. Of course, they'd be vertical. And even a US one like this stood a very good chance of ending up in England eventually, because a lot of 1917s were sent as Lend-Lease during World War II. But yeah, if you see one of these like this, that's why these are in the grip, easy ID. And of course, this pattern of bayonet by Winchester originally would be carried over not only to the US 1917, but also all the trench guns, the M97, M12, even the Ithaca 37, all the way up until the Remington and Mossberg finally got away. But so this British pattern of bayonet mount came into U.S. use for half a century, and I think that's pretty neat. And you can understand how these would get mixed up. So I had to give that aside because these were all in British service as we enter into the interwar period. Again, millions made and millions still being used in the 1930s. Although not in England for much longer. So, by 1932, Britain was already doing trials guns to replace the SMLE Mark.III, which by that time, after 1926, was known as the number 1 Mark.III. That would result in the number 4 Mark I series. But Australia and India would keep on with the Mark.III. Now, Australia would just keep making the P07. They would stop between 1927 and 1940, 41, but they would pick back up for World War II. India, again, this is our Aussie World War I. This is an interwar Ishapur 1937 rifle, showing that they actually brought back the feed cutoff, but not the windage sight or the volley sights. Just thought I'd mention that. Because around 1940, India did its own thing. It essentially went back to the 12-inch blade way back. Well, no. Where are we at? There we are. Here. The 03. But whereas this has kind of the dagger blade and whatnot, this has a simplified and shortened 07. So it has no fuller, one edge. Now some have the extra edge here and some don't. That's just kind of how it is. And this is a Mark II Star, so it has essentially a P07 style rounded grip. And they would put it on their SMLEs because they weren't afraid. You bet I thought I was going to drop that, didn't you? They weren't afraid about it being too short because, frankly, by 1940, this particular bayonet was made in 42. These weren't being used for the original worry. For one thing, they weren't fighting cavalry in any way. That was kind of pie in the sky. And the idea of having essentially a pike duel with rifles and bayonets, it didn't happen either in World War I or World War II. These are mostly just used as last resort or crowd control, police duty. My point is, a 12-inch blade, especially when they simplified it, required less resources, was lighter, easier to use, all around a better idea. And frankly, I bet if England had kept on with the SMLE, they probably would have come to something similar. But they didn't. Their number 4 had its own short, small, little bayonet. A couple of different styles, but we'll talk about that in a different video. But I just wanted to show the Mark II Ishapur, mostly made early on in World War II. I should mention that the Indian parts guns would have an I for Imperator, not for India, and they would continue to have the GR for Georgius Rex up until obviously India split with Great Britain, the Commonwealth, and did their own thing. Just thought I'd mention that. And I brought out quite a neat Indian pattern gun, the 2A1, purpose-built 7.62 NATO Enfield. You can always tell these because of their unique box mag, 10 or 12 rounds. This is really when they start simplifying the guns, but they'd already started simplifying their bayonets, because here we have one more version. The Mishaco MK.III. The blade is essentially the same. Out here, if I relate it. But the grip is really where things are, well, simplified. You can tell it's very squared off in the panels and the pommel. Yeah. But it's still interchangeable. It does have the clearing hole there. And even though this was a, so this one was here, World War II, I think it's 1943 production, bayonets like this would be on our 2A here and 2A1. And I think look very fitting and appropriate. They either have kind of a grayish finish or the black paint that Mishaco is known for tropical. Of course, this one has the Cosmoline finish, but that's okay. And I believe the grips are typically rosewood on these. Could be wrong on that. But yeah, I think it's very squared off grip, matches the very squared off sight protectors and such on these. And as much as I do think the MK.II star is neat, when I think of Indian bayonets, yeah, that's the one I think of. Too cool, in my opinion. But again, I kind of like wartime simplifications. But what do you think? Let me know. And there we have it, guys. And that's being very vague. There are so many marks and stars and stars and different makes and models from every country. So I just wanted to give kind of an outline while I had them to show. From the original P03, essentially a P88 blade and crossguard with a new pattern hilt, to the original P07, which again I actually consider myself fortunate to be able to show you with the hooked quillion. They made quite a few of these, but again, very few survived either refurbishment or frankly the Great War. And the long Arasaka style, it really is amazing just how close to a Type 30 this is to the more common patterns used before, during, and after the Great War, all across the Commonwealth. And of course, yeah, got to talk about the P13, which obviously this is actually an M1917 bayonet, but both were made by Remington. Yeah, this is just the one I grabbed. And then, of course, I really have a sneaking love of the Indian patterns, especially their unfurled blade. I think that is just neat. It's very practical. This one is extremely uncomfortable as a grip. It's gripping a 2x4. But, you know, for as probably little as they actually needed a bayonet for like parade stuff, hey, it worked, guys. So I'm curious, what's your favorite? I thought about including like the number 4 and number 5. I think you understand at the length of this video why we're just keeping to SMLEs, not before, not after. Best I could do. But I appreciate you hanging out. I like to do these historical videos from time to time. They're just rewarding for me, so I hope they are for you as well. And again, if you haven't, check out some of the old Enfield videos. Some of those I'm very proud of. Some I'm embarrassed of. Which ones are which? Check them out to find out. And let me know. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. There's a bird above me now. He's probably going to poop on my head. If you could, also help out on Patreon. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.